Welcome to In Focus with Ejaz Haider. Our top story tonight is about the start of India's illegal exercise of its domicile laws in occupied and annexed Kashmir. We have discussed the issue before, but given its immense significance and the consequences of this exercise, it bears repeating. On 23rd June, Deputy Commissioner Baramulla issued the first such certificate to a girl, a resident of Sopore. To trick the world, the first recipient of the certificate is a resident Kashmiri. This is optics and false communication because the new domicile law has many provisions that are meant to deprive Kashmiris of their right over their own land while settling non-Kashmiris in the area. Further, the exercise is patently illegal because Kashmir is a disputed and occupied land, and India cannot exercise its constitutional writ over matters in Kashmir. But let's dive right into it with Mirza Saaeb, a Kashmiri recently residing at the University of Oxford and studying public policy. Mr. Beg, thank you so much. You and I discussed this earlier also in some detail, but as I said, this is something that bears repeating because the Lieutenant Governor Girish Chandra Murmu, this was exercise, launched on Monday, the e-application cum issuance of domicile certificate. So let's revisit this issue, starting with the fact that, as I mentioned in my opening, that this is in and of itself an illegal exercise because this is a disputed territory, the people are occupied, they haven't had the right to self-determination, and therefore India cannot do anything constitutionally to bring Kashmir under its writ. Let's begin with that.
So just an update since we last spoke on the show. Last time we were discussing the threat of demographic change. What I'd like to inform your viewers about is that demographic change has already taken place. In fact, there's data that has been released as per the 2011 census of Jammu and Kashmir, which indicates that there are about 15 lakh to 17 lakh migrant laborers who are non-Kashmiri, who are present in Jammu and Kashmir, who meet this eligibility criteria of 15-year residence. As we discussed last time, there are three criteria. There's a 7-year study period, a 10-year service period, or a 15-year residence period. So there are already about 15 lakh non-Kashmiris who have met the criteria of just one eligibility mark. So 15 lakh people.
So 15 lakh is basically 1.5 million, because we have viewers that do not understand what lakh means. So I thought, just a matter of clarification.
Yes, that's about 1.5 million people. Now, the total population of Kashmir is around 12 million. So 1.5 million would be nearly 14 to 15% of the total population. I'm just talking about one head right now. I'm not talking about the number of people who will qualify under central government employee quota, under residence quota for the number of people who have studied in Kashmir, their children. I'm not even counting all of that as of now. This is just the preliminary assessment of just one criteria. The second thing I'd like to discuss is, you mentioned in the beginning about this young girl who has just been given a domicile certificate. It's really interesting because you see the domicile certificate is meant, as of now, it is meant for employment opportunities. So a young girl, she's neither going to buy land nor going to get any employment at this age. So it really begs the question what the urgency was for this certificate to be given to her. But yes, you are absolutely right. It is optics because they want to show that this is the beginning of a prosperous new era for Kashmir. You also mentioned about constitutional issues in the beginning statement that you made. I think it's really important to discuss over here the relationship, if we were to assess, one, on international law, two, even under the Indian constitution itself, how this action, it fails the test of both. Now, under international law, obviously, because this is a forced demographic change, it does violate many principles, many laws which India has ratified as well. So it does violate that portion. And even the instrument of accession in itself is contested heavily in Kashmir. But if we were to analyze, even under India's own legal system, you see, there are two provisions which apply over here. One is Article 35A of India's own constitution. The second is Section 6 of the Constitution of Kashmir. Now, Article 35A basically retained and it reinforced that this power has been given to the people of Kashmir to decide who can be a permanent resident. Now, what is happening right now is that the government of India is taking that power to itself. They will decide now who can be Kashmiri. Is a Kashmiri going to be Kashmiri is going to be decided by the government of India. Is an Indian who has met the criteria of living for a certain period in Kashmir, is he now or she going to be Kashmiri, is going to be decided by the government of India. Now, the question, the thing that your viewers need to understand is that the constitution of Jammu and Kashmir was never set up under a sanction of the Indian government, nor has it been set up by an authority under the Indian constitution. What that means in simpler language is that even if Article 35A under the Indian constitution were to be abrogated, were to be amended, Section 6 of Jammu and Kashmir's constitution still stands because there is no provision under which India can abrogate the entire constitution of Jammu and Kashmir. Second thing is, the question that would arise in a jurist's mind is that if Article 35A already covers the same position which is covered under Section 6, which is that the Jammu and Kashmir will itself decide who is a permanent resident. Since this is covered in both, the question arises, why are there two articles or two provisions covering the same thing? The answer to that is that Article 35A in India's constitution was meant to bind India's legal machinery from interference in a right which the constitution of Kashmir has retained for the state itself. So Article 35A was meant to stop Indian interference, not Kashmiri interference. Further, one important thing to understand is that Section 6 forms a part of the most essential features of the Constitution of Jammu and Kashmir because it defines who is eligible to be a part of the state itself. Now, in this sense, it can arguably qualify as a basic feature of the Constitution. So the basic structure doctrine, basic feature doctrine, it's a principle in jurisprudence which basically argues that there are certain features of constitutions that cannot be destroyed. Because tomorrow, if you have a government that comes and says that we don't want to be a democracy anymore, we want to be a monarchy, or we don't want certain things in the constitution, we don't want to call ourselves secular or a republic, or we don't want to have votes, an electoral system of governance. So there are certain features which cannot be destroyed. You can amend certain things. And even India's own Supreme Court has multiple authorities on this area. So the nuanced argument that I'm trying to make is that the definition of who can be a citizen of your state, it's an essential feature, it's a basic feature of your constitution. And India's own Supreme Court has established that even an elected body cannot destroy the basic structure of the Indian constitution, let alone destroy the basic feature of a constitution which is not even Indian. But what is happening in Kashmir right now is that the basic feature of our constitution is being destroyed by an unelected bureaucracy. So it is not even an elected government, it is not even an Indian constitution, and it is a basic feature of our constitution which is being destroyed right now. So this, in a sense, is an update on what we had discussed last time.
Absolutely, and a brilliant position, Mr. Beg. But here's my thought as a lay person, but someone who obviously is interested in law from an interstate relations perspective. Since the essential issue here is India's illegal occupation and now illegal annexation of Kashmir, so while in terms of legal arguments, which you just brilliantly posited, one can perhaps take the internal track to the Indian Supreme Court, I would humbly submit that it's important to retain sight of the fact that this entire exercise of Kashmir being with India in and of itself is illegal to begin with.
Well, that's why I pointed out before I began that the instrument of accession in itself is a contested document. If you were to, not just right now, even in 1947 itself, there is a British legal scholar who was present in the British Foreign Office at that time. His name is Fitzmaurice. He had given a legal opinion saying that, challenging the validity of the instrument of accession. Even today, there is significant challenge to it. That did the Maharaja have the legal authority to bind a people against their will? Even if it is legal, do the people of Kashmir not get to decide the future that they choose for themselves? So, of course, there are tremendous questions to be asked, and a demographic change will completely frustrate those questions. Because once a demographic change has been engineered, the people will vote differently. And again, the question of who is defined as the people in itself is very intrinsic over here. So if you change the definition, if today it's only Kashmiris, it's only people who have state subject certificates, but now the state subject certificate it's a meaningless document. It is just going to be used for evidentiary purpose to prove that you're a domicile. So it's a circular exercise which is being conducted. So the accession in itself is a contested thing. Kashmir in itself is a disputed territory. I would argue over here that yes, it is causing a tremendous change to the future of Kashmir. It is going to be an irreversible change on deciding that future. And that is precisely what the Indian government wants. They want to engineer chaos. They want to engineer confusion, because once people come in, non-Kashmiris come in to settle into Kashmir, how will you get them out? Are we envisaging a future of bloodshed and war against those people now? Because it pushes us into a different legal debate as to the rights of those settlers also. Say 20 years down the line, 30 years, 50 years down the line, those settlers will have children in Kashmir. They will be a part of the economic structure there. They'll be a part of the social structure there. How do you push them out of that structure then? So it is complicating the situation. It is going to be an irreversible change. And as Kashmiris, we have been discussing this at almost every forum now, that this is this move is going to have a calamitous repercussion in Kashmir, because we do not know how much more volatile this situation can turn. Are those people who come into Kashmir, are they going to be armed by the Indian government? One example I can give you of this, I'm not making a statement, an alarmist statement over here. This is based on fact. Just in the last 1 month, after a sarpanch, a non-Muslim, a Hindu sarpanch had been killed in Kashmir, there were calls from Indian media as well as leading Indian personalities who really influence Indian politics. They made open calls of arming the non-Muslim population, giving them arms. So just to be clear over here, they're talking about giving civilians arms in Kashmir, non-Muslim population of Kashmir. What are they trying to engineer?
This is like the Israelis, armed Israeli settlers. Just one point before we move on, Mr. Beg, with reference to Azad Kashmir and Gilgit-Baltistan. Since I belong to this side of the line of control, Poonch uprising is very clear, the history is very clear. We liberated these areas much before any instrument of accession. And in fact, the Maharaja had by then lost control of his territories. This is something, as you know, Snedden and others have written about, ditto for Gilgit-Baltistan. But let me ask you, since I talked about the Israeli settlers, I see there are these areas of convergence or similarities, if you will, between what's happening in occupied Kashmir and what the Israelis have done with the Palestinian land. In which case, I would also want you to, apprise our viewers of what the relevant laws are, international law, covenants or treaties or provisions, which are being violated by this Indian move.
This is a very important thing, but I'd like to point out over here that while we see parallels with what is happening in Palestine, we cannot compare oppressions. What is happening in Palestine has to be assessed in its own plane. What's happening in Kashmir has to be assessed in its own plane. And in fact, I would argue that what's happening in Kashmir is far worse than what's happening in Palestine, because there is recognition to what is going on in Palestine. There is no recognition to what's happening in Kashmir. There is a legal structure. In fact, look at the Israeli court system. The prime minister right now has been charged with corruption and he is facing trial. The trial has been postponed because of the COVID crisis. Such a situation will never arise in India, where the Prime Minister will face a charge from an Indian court. What I'm trying to say is that the situation over there...
No, I get your point. And that's a valid point.
But coming specifically to your question on the parallels, first of all, what the Israeli government has done is that they have engineered, the court system have engineered a principle known as the center of life principle, which is to show that a Palestinian has to show that his or her center of life is in Jerusalem. And if they fail to do that, they will lose their residency rights. There is also a provision where if they are accused of breaching allegiance or minimum loyalty to Israel, then they will also lose their residency rights. This has in fact happened in 2006. There was a case against 4 members of Hamas who had been elected to a legislative council. They elected to the Palestinian Legislative Council, and they were also their residency rights were revoked because they had been said to have breached minimum allegiance to Israel. Now, in India also, there is a tremendous wave of nationalism where you need to wear your Indian nationalism on your sleeve. And Kashmiris inherently are opposed to this for obvious reasons. So once these, if you take it to the logical conclusion, what does this nationalism mean? Proving your love for India. Should a territory like Kashmir, which is disputed, be forced? Should the people of Kashmir be forced to prove their affection or allegiance to a territory that is oppressing them? Under international humanitarian law, it explicitly forbids the occupier from demanding allegiance of an occupied population. So, and of course, the demographic change also which is taking place, that is also against customary international law. It's an act of war. But again, the reason why a lot is not happening at the international front, for example, if you look at Palestine also, the same principles apply there as well. There are judgments also that have been passed by rulings that have been passed by international courts on what is happening what Israel is doing in Palestine. But no action is taking place because at the end of the day, international law is a toothless force of law. The reason you have to abide by the law is because that law carries penal sanction. If you don't abide by the law, you will be punished. You'll be jailed or you'll be penalized. But in international law, the only way to penalize someone is to either impose sanctions or go to war. So, of course, there is soft power diplomacy, and you can counter and challenge on that basis as well. But the most effective way is sanctions, or if you take an armed movement against it, a war against the territory that is breaking those rules. But of course, we don't, as Kashmiris, we don't advocate for war. We would prefer that we want India, Pakistan, and the people of Kashmir to live in peace because we have no animosity against anyone. We are only
but unfortunately, I totally agree with your sentiment, Mr. Beg, but unfortunately, there are times when one has to look at measures other than just simply talking about things. But thank you so much. It's always a pleasure talking to you and listening to your nuanced reasoning. We shall take a short break here and return to discuss India's new move against Pakistan, even as Delhi reels under the shock of new tensions with China. Stay with us. Welcome back to In Focus. Our second topic of discussion tonight is Pakistan's denunciation of India's allegations against the conduct of diplomatic staff in Pakistan's High Commission in Delhi. India says a Ministry of Foreign Affairs handout has made baseless allegations to justify its decision to seek 50% reduction in the staff strength of the Pakistan HC in Delhi. The handout dismisses allegations of any violation of the Vienna Convention on diplomatic relations by Pakistani diplomats, saying they always function within the parameters of international law and diplomatic norms. To discuss this development further, we have with us Dr. Rifat Khan, who is head of Public Policy Department at the National University of Science and Technology, and we shall also be joined by Ambassador Aziz Khan, a former High Commissioner to India. Dr. Hussain, it's very interesting that at a moment when India is reeling under pressure from China, it has started to double down on Pakistan and, harassing the diplomats in Delhi, then declaring them persona non grata, and so on and so forth. So give me a reading of this situation.
Well, Ejaz, in my judgment, there are two significant issues in the latest expulsion or the desire of the Indians that Pakistan should cut its diplomatic staff into half. As you know, that there are about 106 Pakistani diplomats and staffers who are posted in New Delhi. It's one of the largest missions that have Pakistan. And on that basis, the Indians also have a large mission in Pakistan. But the most important thing is for us to not to forget that India has been constantly trying to find excuses to not to engage with Pakistan diplomatically. So this latest effort to expel the diplomats and declare them PNGs and ask them to leave from New Delhi is the indication of that trend. Number one. Number two, because as the Indians are coming under pressure, as you mentioned rightly, from China, so they cannot do this kind of a behavior vis-a-vis India, vis-a-vis China. So they are picking on Pakistan as a kind of a scapegoat to vent their anger and to pacify their anti-China public feeling inside India. And the third, from Pakistan's larger perspective, is the New Delhi's attempt to annex Jammu and Kashmir last August, and subsequently the agitation that they have faced and the challenges that they have faced is another reason. So they think that they can get away with murder, and and this in my judgment is the most unfair thing that had happened. Both countries have engaged in a tit-for-tat explosion in the past, but this latest stance, to me, deviates from that because it has new variables built into this.
Absolutely. Now, interestingly, Dr. Hussain, there was on Tuesday, which was yesterday, Russia, India, China trilateral. Obviously, it was virtual. And at the trilateral, Dr. S. Jaishankar, who is a former diplomat and currently the foreign minister of India, said, and I'm directly quoting from what he said, "This special meeting reiterates our belief in the time-tested principles of international relations, but the challenge today is not just one of concepts and norms, but equally of their practice," unquote. Now, it sounds very ironic that while Dr. Jaishankar is talking about not just the concept and norms, but also the practice of diplomacy and of course good sense and decency, India's approach to Pakistan reflects none of these values.
What I was saying was that Indians have made a habit, particularly under Modi, of treating Pakistan as an extremist. So even have lots of problems in their neighborhood, in their smaller countries. But going back to the Gujarat doctrine, India wants to treat Pakistan as an exception rather than as a rule. So under this view, they want to engage with Pakistan diplomatically, and they would not like it to have the common courtesy of treating their diplomats very well. So this is, and the basic purpose is to paint Pakistan as an
Absolutely. Thank you. That was Dr. Ejaz Haider speaking with us. We are now joined by Ambassador Aziz Khan, a former High Commissioner to India. Ambassador Khan, thank you so much for being with us. We're discussing that while India is reeling under pressure from China, given its decision that there should be a reduction of 50% staff, based on allegations that the Pakistani diplomatic staff was behaving undiplomatically, and as I said in my opening before you joined us, that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has categorically and unequivocally denounced them as baseless allegations. But India seems to be doubling down as far as Pakistan is concerned. Given your own experience of India, give me a sense of what you read in this.
I think this is a standard trick that India employs to divert attention from the crisis it is facing, to divert it towards Pakistan. They have done it before, and I'm sure that this is not the last time that they would do it. And but in case of Pakistan, also they have been red-faced several times. If you recall, quite a few days ago, there was that episode of the spy pigeons that had gone on to India, and once they became a laughing stock of the world, they suddenly pounced on two officials of the High Commission and said that they were indulging in undesirable activities and threw them out. Now, after facing what they faced from China and facing the criticism from China, as well as the atrocities that they are committing in the Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir, where even after 10 months, they have not been able to achieve their objectives. People are resisting, and those poor people, Kashmiris, are in a virtual lockdown. In order to divert attention, and that is increasingly coming under criticism internationally, at least in the form of op-eds and statements, and the most recent of which was the contact group of OIC. So in order to detract attention from all that, India has seen it fit to suddenly say that the High Commission was indulging in undesirable activities and have asked to reduce the number by half. This is such a ridiculous claim because under these difficult circumstances at the moment when there is COVID and also the Indian high-handedness on Kashmir and on Muslims as well as on the High Commission of Pakistan. For the High Commission staff, which can barely come from their houses to the office, to say that they were indulging in undesirable activities is totally preposterous, and it is simply a tactic to divert attention from the various problems that problems of its own creation that India is facing. What worries me more is also that this is not going to work very much for them, and then we might better be prepared for some kind of increased activity along the LOC and their so-called surgical strikes that they have always been claiming that they have been put to good effect. But these are all tactics, and it's a pity because it shows the desperation that India is facing at the moment, and it's resorting to such tactics while at the same time claiming to be a regional power and claiming to be a great power. These are not the kind of tactics that a country which has aspirations for a regional influence should resort to.
Absolutely. But, sir, give me a sense of, since, you've headed so many missions, especially when you were High Commissioner to India, what is the practice in terms of, because all of these are underpinned by certain conventions, like the Vienna Convention. There are common and diplomatic decencies. What exactly is the practice, and how is India violating this practice in this particular case?
India is violating this practice. There was no other reason. So what they have resorted to is that just the same way as they asked two of our staffers to leave a few days ago, now they have gone ahead and claimed that they were indulging in undesirable activities. Under these circumstances, although there is no evidence of that and there is no proof that they can provide for it, but the countries in desperate situations resort to this kind of an activity. It is contrary to normal diplomatic practice. It is contrary to the conventions about diplomatic practice, which is agreed to international law. But then a country has the possibility to declare people persona non grata, claiming that they were indulging in undesirable activities and asked in the reduction of staff. But it is something that should not be, that I'm sure the world is not going to appreciate very much.
Ambassador Khan, sir, one final question. Nepal, which has had such close relations with India, Nepal is literally, they've set up pickets, armed pickets. Bangladesh, probably the closest country, is very unhappy because of the CAA and some other laws. Pakistan, of course, has traditionally been a rival. Now they've had this run-in with China. It seems that both in terms of, on all fronts, the foreign policy front, the COVID-19 crisis, the slowdown of Indian economy, Narendra Modi seems to be losing his sheen. And, once that happens, he is likely to do something silly as far as Pakistan is concerned.
That is precisely what I pointed to, that what worries me now is that all these tactics that Narendra Modi has employed are not going to work very much. And in an act of desperation, what he will do is to increase pressure on the LOC. As it is, you have seen how many violations are taking place regularly across the LOC with Pakistan. Every day there is firing, every day unprovoked firing in which civilians are dying, and there is under the false allegations that Pakistan is sending in terrorists and so on, whereas on our side we have the United Nations Observers Group who are free to go and monitor the LOC from our side, which India does not permit. But nonetheless, India, I'm afraid India is likely to do something silly on the LOC, and I'm sure we are, of course, prepared for that. And but it may lead to unnecessary trouble, and it is time that the international community took note of that. And I'm sure our foreign office is making all efforts to let the world see. There was a pretty strong statement by the foreign minister yesterday. So hopefully we should be able to diplomatically not let India do something silly, but we should be prepared for that, because this has been a regular pattern with this particular regime.
Absolutely. Thank you. That was Ambassador Aziz Khan speaking with us. This is all from In Focus this week. We shall see you Monday at the same time. Keep following our latest updates on social media at indus.news. Good night and goodbye.